is conditional logic the number one foundation for logical reasoning questions? I would say, honestly, no. I don't think there's any one particular foundation for LR. I think that conditionality is really important. I think that cause and effect is really important. I think that, of course, having a good handle on diagramming is useful, but it's not the only thing. I think that most logical reasoning questions are actually informal in nature, meaning that you have to engage with the argument as if somebody were speaking it to you in a real world sense, engaging like in a debate with a friend or a colleague or something like that. So I think that diagramming is really an overused strategy. It's an overused technique. It doesn't actually come up that often. You'll see that I didn't diagram any of these. I don't even know how you would have diagrammed any of these necessary assumption questions or any of these pointed issue questions. I think that they just don't lend themselves to it neatly. You're going to end up writing out by hand everything the stimulus said. It's not going to be useful. And the same goes for the next question you were asking about the contrapositive. I think that the contrapositive is one tool out of many, many, many tools you're going to be using on the LSAT. Contrapositive is a technique you will sometimes use when you're diagramming, but it's not the only tool. I think that contrapositives actually come up more in logic games, and even then they're not coming up that often. They're coming up in conditional chain games like what we were doing last week with a couple of the games that we looked at there. So I wouldn't overly focus on it. It's not the sort of thing where you use it every question or every time. You don't want to fall into the trap where you're holding it like a hammer and then everything looks like a nail, where you just want to say, oh, I'll use the contrapositive here, I'll use the contrapositive there. It just isn't really that useful most of the time. When it is useful, of course, you're going to want to use it, but I think it comes up more in formal logic settings, specifically for must be true and most supported questions, inference questions. That's really where it comes up most frequently in LR. And then I think, again, you were asking about the most important foundation or thing to memorize for LR. There isn't really one particular thing, and there isn't any one thing I'd say you want to memorize. I think that having a basic familiarity with the flaws is really useful. But again, also, most LR questions don't involve classic logical fallacies. Some do, some don't. I have an article here that I think I sent you in the chat already. I'll send it again just in case. But basically, this page here on my site has some classic logical fallacies to look at, such as false cause, correlation causation, which is a really big one. There's appeal to emotion. There's personal attacks ad hominem. There's the gambler's fallacy. There's appeal to authority, part to whole, which we talked about a little bit earlier. There's circular reasoning. There's a false dichotomy, middle ground. So you could review these as a way to get some familiarity with the classic logical fallacies, but there are many, many other fallacies as well. And then there are some where there's, like I talked about earlier, where you have this idea of the small gap and the big gap. In those cases, it's not really any sort of abstract logical idea you could relate back to. It's just kind of unique to the situation at hand where they failed to consider X, Y, Z. And so as an exercise, one thing you might want to do is on my site, walk through this big categorization of virtually every LSAT logical reasoning question ever, where they are grouped by type, and you can walk through them. You see the first category here is flaw in the reasoning questions. I've got them here all the way from prep test number 7 down to, keep going, down to prep test 59 or so. So many logical reasoning questions you could practice. And you see here that even some of them have in parentheses the particular classic logical fallacy they exhibit, but then many of them don't exhibit a classic logical fallacy. And so that's more just relating in a real world sense. So you could go through these, and you see there's a bunch from Juno 7 as well. If you want to practice with the free LSAT on LSAC's website, to look at those there. We touched on a couple of these, I think, tonight, but of course there are many, many more for you to look at.